Hi everyone, and welcome to my video on the concept of Tihai in Indian music. Now Tihai is just a phrase of notes that's repeated 3 times. And those phrases either have equal gaps in between them or no gaps at all. But more importantly, a Tihai very often ends on the first beat of a new cycle. And many of you will know that the first beat of a new cycle is referred to as the sum. And what I'm going to do in today's video is I'm going to take a Tihai phrase and show how that phrase can be played from different points in the beat cycle and then end up on the sum or end up on the first beat of a new cycle. And the Taal that I'm going to use to demonstrate this is Tin Taal, very common in Indian music. It has 16 matra or 16 beats. And the phrase that I'm going to use is Tira Kita Da. So the phrase Tira Kita Da and starting in different places within the Tin Taal cycle, played as a Tihai and showing you how that ends up on the first beat of a new cycle. So let's start by examining what would happen if I played the phrase Tira Kita Da, this 3 matra phrase, from the first beat of Tin Taal without any gaps at all between the phrases. Where would I end up? Well, let's have a look. Tira Kita Da, Tira Kita Da, Tira Kita Da. Well, it's quite obviously 9 beats long, so I'd end up on the 9th beat. But we decided at the start of the video that we wanted to show how the phrase ended up on the first beat of a cycle, because we know that Tihai very often ends up on the first beat. So how am I going to manipulate that phrase in order to end up on the first beat of a new cycle? Well, quite obviously I have to use gaps in between those phrases. But the question becomes, how many gaps do I need to use? So let's for example try one gap. Where would I be? So, Tira Kita Da gap, Tira Kita Da gap, Tira Kita Da. Okay, that's finishing on the 11th beat. But I need to finish on the first beat of a new cycle. In theory, the 17th beat. Because the first beat of a new Tin Taal cycle is actually the 17th beat, or the first beat of a new cycle. So, clearly I need to have more gaps than one. Because with one gap I only finished on the 11th beat. Let's try 3 gaps. Starting on the first beat. Tira Kita Da, 1, 2, 3. Tira Kita Da, 1, 2, 3. Tira Kita Da. Well, here I finished on the 15th beat. So again, that's not great because I still got 2 beats left. Now let's try it with 4 gaps in between the phrase. Okay, so in between the phrase of Tira Kita Da, which is again 3 beats long, and 4 gaps in between the phrase. So, Tira Kita Da, 1, 2, 3, 4. Tira Kita Da, 1, 2, 3, 4. Tira Kita Da. And of course, it worked perfectly. Okay? So a phrase of 3 beats or 3 matras with 4 gaps in between the phrases will finish on the first beat of a new Tin Taal cycle, or the sum. Let's go and demonstrate that on the tabla. So using our set phrase Tira Kita Da, which is 3 beats long within Tin Taal, with 4 gaps in between each of the phrases, starting on the 1 or starting on the sum of Tin Taal and finishing on the 1 of a new cycle of Tin Taal, so finishing on the sum itself, so a sum to sum Tihai using the phrase Tira Kita Da with 4 gaps. Let's speak it first and then we'll play it. Tira Kita Da, 1, 2, 3, 4. Tira Kita Da, 1, 2, 3, 4. Tira Kita Da. Okay, so I'll play the Tin Taal cycle first and then the Tihai phrase. I'll speak it so you get an idea of how it works from sum to sum. Tin Taal cycle first. Da, din, din, da, da, din, din, da, da, din, din, da, da, din, din, da. Tira Kita Da, 1, 2, 3, 4. Tira Kita Da, 1, 2, 3, 4. Tira Kita Da. finishing on the 1. Now without speaking. And back to speaking again. And then finishing this time. Da, 1, 2, 3, 4. Dida, kita, da, 1, 2, 3, 4. Dida, kita, da. So the phrase Dida, kita, da with 4 gaps in between each of the phrases. Why? So that it makes it end on the first beat of a new cycle. So having seen how a tihai is played sum to sum using the phrase Dida, kita, da with 4 gaps, let's take away one of the gaps and see where we need to start the phrase Dida, kita, da in order to still end up on the sum of the next cycle. So if I take away a gap each, it means I'm taking 2 beats away, because instead of having 4 gaps and 4 gaps, I've now got 3 gaps and 3 gaps in between my phrase. So it would be Dida, kita, da, 1, 2, 3. Dida, kita, da, 1, 2, 3. Dida, kita, da. So I've got 2 beats less. So that means I need to start 2 beats forward in the Tin Taal cycle in order for my phrase to finish on the sum or the first beat of a new cycle. So I need to play the first 2 beats of Tin Taal and then play my phrase Dida, kita, da, but this time with 3 gaps. And then I'll end up, again of course, on the sum, or the first beat of a Tin Taal cycle. So again I'll play Tin Taal, and then I'll play 2 beats into the Tin Taal cycle, the next Tin Taal cycle, then play the Tihai phrase with 3 gaps in between this time, and it should finish on the sum. Before I do that actually, it might be an idea to clap it first, so you understand what I mean. So, da, din, dida, kita, da, 1, 2, 3. Dida, kita, da, 1, 2, 3, dida, kita, da. So that would end up again on the first beat. So played as just the Tin Taal cycle first. Da, din, din, da, da, din, din, da. Da, din, dida, kita, da, 1, 2, 3. Dida, kita, da, 1, 2, 3. Dida, kita, da. So finishing on the sum. So this time I had to start on the 3rd beat of the Tin Taal cycle. I had to play the first 2 beats of Tin Taal, start on the 3rd beat, play my phrase Dida, kita, da, leave this time 3 beats in between, or 3 gaps in between each of the phrases, and of course then it would end up on the sum of a new cycle. So having seen how we had 4 gaps in between our phrase Dida, kita, da, and then 3 gaps in between, now let's have a look at what happens when we have 2 gaps. Well, of course, we've now got to go 2 beats forward in Tin Taal. So it would be da, din, din, da, Dida, kita, da, 1, 2, Dida, kita, da, 1, 2, Dida, kita, da. So by now, I'm sure you're getting the idea that every time you take away a gap, it's repeated. That gap is actually doubled because it's a gap from the first, from between phrase 1 and 2, and a gap from between phrase 2 and 3. So in total, it's actually 2 matras, or 2 beats that you're taking away. So that means that you have to go 2 beats forward in whichever cycle that you're playing in order for the tihai to still finish on the first beat of a new cycle, or still finish on the sum. So, in this case, I demonstrate it again. Da, din, din, da, Dida, kita, da, 1, 2, Dida, kita, da, 1, 2, Dida, kita, da. So we spoke the Tin Taal 4 beats in, or 4 matras in, and then we started our tihai phrase from beat number 5 with 2 gaps, and of course, sure enough, it finished on the sum. So it will be played like this. Again, Tin Taal, one cycle, and then our Tihai. So, da din din da da din din da din din da da din din da din din da tira kita da 1 2 tira kita da 1 2 tira kita da. And this time without speaking it. 4 beats in. 1 2 3 4. Okay, so a Tihai phrase starting on the 5th beat with 2 gaps and finishing on the sum of a new Tin Taal cycle. Okay, our 3 matra Tihai phrase or 3 beat Tihai phrase, Tira Kita Da, starting on the 5th beat, 2 gaps in between, and again finishing on the sum in Tin Taal. So now, which beat would we need to start on in the Tin Taal cycle in order for us to have the Tihai phrase that we've used, Tira Kita Da, but this time only 1 gap in between the phrases? Yep, you've guessed it, it's the 7th beat in Tin Taal. We've got to go 2 beats forward again. So we knew when we had 2 gaps in between the Tihai phrase, Tira Kita Da, it started on the 5th beat. Now, if we have only 1 gap in between the Tihai phrase, Tira Kita Da, we need to go 2 beats forward from the 5th, so that means it's going to start, that Tihai phrase is going to start on the 7th beat. So we need to play the first 6 beats of the Tin Taal cycle, and then our Tihai phrase is going to come in, but remember, we need to still leave 1 gap in between the phrases for it to still end up on the sum of a new cycle. So, it would be spoken as this. Da din din da da din, tira kita da 1, tira kita da 1, tira kita da, and demonstrated as. So 6 beats in, da din din da da din, tira kita da 1, tira kita da 1, tira kita da. Finish. Da din din da da din, tira kita da, tira kita da, tira kita da. So we've looked so far at how we've had gaps in between each of the Tihai phrases. And of course remember, those gaps have to be equal. So we started off with the phrase Tira Kita Da and 4 gaps in between. So it started on the first beat of Tin Taal and finished on the first beat. So it was a sum to sum Tihai. Then we reduced the number of gaps by 1 for each. So it was 3 gaps in between, and it started on the 3rd beat of Tin Taal. Then we had 2 gaps in between, and it started on the 5th beat of Tin Taal in order to finish on the sum. And then finally we had 1 gap in between the phrases, and that meant that we had to start on the 7th beat of Tin Taal in order for our phrase Tira Kita Da with 1 gap to finish on the sum of the next cycle of Tin Taal, on the first beat of Tin Taal. So now, if we had no gaps at all, then where would we need to start? Well, on the 9th beat, we just again move it 2 beats forward. So now, no gaps at all in between the Tihai phrase Tira Kita Da, starting on the 9th beat. And some of you will know that the 9th beat in the Tin Taal phrase is referred to as Kali. So actually, the phrase Tira Kita Da, which is 3 matras long, starting on the Kali with no gaps in between, actually finishes on the sum. It's starting on Kali and finishes on sum. Okay? So again, we'll speak that and then I'll demonstrate it on the tabla. Da din din da da din din da. Tira kita da, tira kita da, tira kita da. Okay, and it will be played like this. Again, 1 cycle of Tin Taal first, just to feel the tempo. So da din din da da din din da, tira kita da, tira kita da, tira kita da, da da din da, din da da time our phrase tira kita da, starting on the kali of Tin Taal and finishing on the sum. Now let's look at ways that we can make the Tihai sound more interesting. We could, for instance, play notes in between the gaps between the Tihai phrase. So, for example, in the first Tihai that we looked at, where we had 4 gaps, the sum to sum Tihai, where we had tira kita da and then 4 gaps, 1, 2, 3, 4, we could play the phrase takita takita da gap. So it would sound like this. Tira kita da, takita takita da, tira kita da, takita takita da, tira kita da. So we've actually filled the gaps with some notes in order to make the Tihai sound more interesting. So the Tihai is still tira kita da, but we're filling up the gaps with a different phrase in order to kind of make things sound better. Okay, so how would that be played on the tabla? Well, something like this. Da, din, din, da, da, din, din, da, da, din, din, da, da, din, din. Tira kita da, da, tira kita da, da, tira kita da. So again, without speaking. With speaking and finishing. Tira kita da, takita takita da, tira kita da, takita takita da, tira kita da. Okay, so let's do the same thing now with the Tihai phrase that had 3 gaps in between. So this time I'll use the phrase nagatete gina gina da. Okay, so it would be da din tira kita da, nagatete gina gina da, tira kita da, nagatete gina gina da, tira kita da. Okay, so the 3-beat gap, I'm now playing the phrase nagatete gina gina da, but remember the Tihai is still tira kita da. I'm just playing that phrase of notes in between the gaps in between the Tihai. Okay, so it'll sound like this. Da din din da da. Without speaking. And again, speaking to finish. Da din tira kita da, na kita da, tira kita da, na kita da, tira kita da. So we've already looked at how we filled up the 4 gaps in between the phrase tira kita da to start from the sum, and we used the phrase takita takita da with a gap, and then we filled up the 3 gaps in between our Tihai phrase with nagatete gina gina da. So now let's try filling up the 2 gaps in between our Tihai phrase with a phrase like krada. Okay, so we can use the phrase krada to fill up the 2 gaps. And then of course it would be starting on the 5th beat. So let's see how that works. Da din din da, tira kita da, krada tira kita da, krada tira kita da. And again of course finishes on the sum. We haven't done anything, we've just played a phrase in between the 2 beats. Okay? How would that sound? Well, it's just quite like this. Da din din da, again Tin Taal first. time using the phrase krada for our 2-beat gap in between our Tihai phrase. What about if we had 1 gap? What could we do? Well, for example, we could play cut. So our phrase would be tira kita da kat, tira kita da kat, tira kita da. And again, this time we're starting in a different place in the time cycle. Move it 2 beats on, so we'd start on the 7th matra. Okay, so it would be da din din da din, tira kita da kat, tira kita da kat, tira kita da. How would that sound? So, like this. Da din din da din din da, da din din da din din, da din din da din, tira kita da kat, tira kita da kat, tira kita da din da. Without speaking. Notice how I'm playing the cut a little bit more powerfully, and I'm actually taking the power of the da away. Just a way of interpreting that particular Tihai, emphasizing the cut as opposed to the da. So now you can see how we've looked at ways in which we could make the Tihai phrases sound interesting by filling up the gaps with different notes. So where we had 4 gaps, we played takita takita da. Where we had 3 gaps, we played nagita gita gita da. Where we had 2 gaps, we had krada. And then finally where we had 1 gap, we just put a cut. But it made the Tihai phrases sound much more interesting to the ear. So we've already looked at how you can make your Tihai phrases sound much more interesting by filling up the gaps with different notes. But there are other ways where you can make your Tihais more interesting, and that's actually making the phrase itself a little bit more complicated. But keeping actually the number of matras the same. So our original phrase was tira kita da. But supposing we played taka taka tira kita da. So that would be a little bit more interesting. How would that work if we played it sum to sum? Well, just quite like this. Da din din da din din da din din da din din da. Taka taka tiri kita da 1 2 3 4. Taka taka tiri kita da 1 2 3 4. Taka taka tiri kita da. So nothing has changed. The gaps still remain the same. We've just changed the notes. Instead of playing tiri kita da, we've made it slightly more complicated. We played taka taka tiri kita da. So it would sound like this. 1 2 3 4. 1 2 3 4. So sum to sum Tihai using the phrase tak tak tiri kita da. 1 2 3 4. 1 2 3 4. Okay, 4-beat gap. Now a 3-beat gap. So starting on the 3rd beat. Tak tak tiri kita da from the 3rd beat. Da din din da. Remember it's 3 gaps this time. Da din din da. 1 2 3. Da 1 2 3. Da. And now with 2 gaps, starting on 5. sum. So it makes it a little bit more interesting when the phrase changes. 2, 1, 2, and now with one gap, this time starting on the 7th beat. Finally, from the Kali or the 9th beat, this time no gaps at all, finishing on the sum. Tihai cycle first, Tin Taal cycle first, beg your pardon. So, so we've looked at in this video how the phrase tira kita da can be played in different places in the Tin Taal cycle, and by manipulating the gaps in between the phrases to end up on the sum or the first beat of a new cycle. Then we actually embellished the Tihai by putting notes, phrases in between the gaps, and then we reverted back and changed the actual Tihai phrase from tira kita da to taka taka tira kita da. Now, to round things off, I'm going to use the phrase taka taka tira kita da and the embellishments in between all the gaps, and we'll see how that sounds. So the sum to sum Tihai, taka taka tira kita da with takita takita da, spoken as taka taka tira kita da, takita takita da, taka taka tira kita da, takita takita da, taka taka tira kita da. Okay, and the second phrase, taka taka tira kita da, but this time with naga tira gina gina da. So it would be da din, taka taka tira kita da, naga tira gina gina da, taka taka tira kita da, naga tira gina gina da, taka taka tira kita da, din din da da, din din da. 2 beats in, da din, taka tira kita da, naga tira gina da, taka tira kita da, naga tira gina da, taka tira kita da, din din da da, din din da. Okay, so now with 2 beats, so it would be krada. Da din din da, taka taka tira kita da, krada, taka taka tira kita da, krada, taka taka tira kita da, din din da. Finally with 1 beat in between, so just cut. So it'll be da din din da din, taka taka tira kita da cut, taka taka tira kita da cut, taka taka tira kita da. And remember this time it has to start on the 7th beat. So now what I'll try to demonstrate is all the Tihai phrases and all the embellishments in between the gaps. So something like this. So there you have it, all the phrases, all the embellishments in succession. I really hope you enjoyed my video on the concept of Tihai and that you can bring in some of those concepts into your playing, particularly within the light music sphere.